Every government claims to serve the people. Every politician promises stability, prosperity, and growth. They stand at podiums, they debate in parliaments, and they ask for your vote. But behind the speeches, behind the campaigns, and behind the illusion of democracy, there is another force. It is quieter. It is more technical. It operates in the shadows of skyscrapers and behind the closed doors of boardrooms. But it is far more powerful than any president or prime minister. That force is the central bank. These institutions do not march in parades. They do not run for office. Most citizens cannot even name the people in charge of them. Yet these unelected bodies decide how much money exists in the world. They decide who gets bailed out when the system cracks. They decide which banks live and which banks die. With the stroke of a key, they can make your mortgage cheaper, or they can crush the value of your savings until your retirement fund is worthless. They can do all of this without a single vote from you. This is the secret history of central banks, the story of how a handful of private institutions became the real power brokers of the modern world. To understand how we got here, we have to look back before the modern era, to a time when money was simple. For thousands of years, money was a commodity. It was gold. It was silver. It was something you could hold, something that had weight and intrinsic value. If a king wanted to wage war, he had to tax his subjects or borrow gold. There was a limit. Reality provided a check on power. But kings and emperors have always despised limits. They wanted to spend more than they had. They wanted to expand empires without the immediate pain of taxation. The turning point came in the 17th century. Europe was in turmoil. Wars were draining treasuries across the continent. In England, King William III was desperate. He needed cash to fund a war against France, but his credit was ruined. Lenders were wary. The crown had a reputation for defaulting on its debts. The king needed a solution that defied the laws of traditional economics. He found it in a proposal from a Scottish financier named William Paterson. The deal they struck in 1694 changed the world forever. Paterson proposed a bank that would lend the king the gold he needed. In return, this bank would receive a special privilege, the monopoly to issue paper notes. These notes were not gold, but they were promises to pay gold, backed by the government's debt. For the first time, money in circulation was not just metal, but debt itself. The Bank of England was born. It became the king's creditor and the nation's banker. The lesson learned was intoxicating. If you control the flow of credit, you control the state itself. Other nations saw the power this gave Britain. The ability to print money to fund wars gave the British Empire a financial muscle that Napoleon and other rivals could not match. Napoleon's armies marched on gunpowder, but Britain's armies marched on credit. The central banking model spread across Europe like a virus. It was efficient, it was powerful, and it allowed governments to grow larger than ever before. But across the Atlantic, a new nation was forming with a deep suspicion of this very system. The founding fathers of the United States had seen how the Bank of England manipulated the economy and consolidated power. Thomas Jefferson, one of the principal architects of America, warned that banking institutions were more dangerous to purely Republican liberties than standing armies. He understood that if the American people ever allowed private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks would deprive the people of all property until their children woke up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. For over a century, the United States fought a bitter war against the concept of a central bank. They established the first Bank of the United States and then let its charter expire. They established the second bank, and President Andrew Jackson killed it. Jackson famously told the bankers, "You are a den of vipers and thieves. I intend to rout you out, and by the eternal God, I will rout you out."
For decades, America prospered without a central bank. The economy was volatile, yes, but it was growing at an unprecedented rate, built on real savings and industrial production.
However, the bankers were patient. They knew that chaos created opportunity. The American financial system in the late 19th century was fragmented. Panics were common. The most famous came in 1907, when a collapse on Wall Street threatened to pull the entire economy into the abyss. Banks failed, depositors panicked, and the stock market crashed. It wasn't the government that saved the day. It was a private banker, J.P. Morgan. From his mansion in New York, Morgan summoned the leading financiers of the age, locked the doors, and forced them to provide liquidity to stop the panic. One man had stabilized the American financial system. For the political class, this was humiliating. For the public, it was terrifying. But for the bankers, it was the perfect excuse. They argued that America needed an institution that could act like Morgan, but officially, permanently, and on behalf of the nation. They claimed they wanted to stop the money trust of Wall Street. In reality, they were the money trust, and they were about to write the rules of the game. In November 1910, a secret train car left Hoboken, New Jersey. The blinds were drawn. The passengers were instructed to use only their first names. On board were the most powerful men in global finance: Senator Nelson Aldrich, bankers from the Morgan Empire, and representatives of the Rockefeller dynasty. Their destination was Jekyll Island, an exclusive hunting club off the coast of Georgia. For over a week, in complete secrecy, they drafted the legislation that would become the Federal Reserve Act. They returned to Washington with a plan. They didn't call it a central bank. That name was too unpopular. They called it the Federal Reserve System to make it sound governmental, decentralized, and safe. They sold it to Congress as a way to stabilize the economy and protect the common man from Wall Street panics. It was a masterstroke of deception. In 1913, just days before Christmas, when many congressmen had already left for the holidays, the Federal Reserve Act was passed. America had handed the keys to its economy to a private banking cartel. The Federal Reserve was designed to be independent from day-to-day politics, but it was deeply connected to the banks it was supposed to regulate. It could issue currency, set interest rates, and act as a lender of last resort. Few people realized how much power had just been created, but the world was about to find out. World War I was the first great test. The costs of industrial warfare were staggering. No nation could pay for tanks, airplanes, and machine guns with taxes alone. It was politically impossible. So central banks stepped in. They printed money. They bought government bonds. They kept the war machine fed with easy credit. The gold standard, the ancient anchor of money, was effectively abandoned as nations suspended the ability to convert paper notes into metal. The lesson was brutal, but clear. When governments face an existential crisis, central banks will finance them, regardless of the long-term cost. The printing press was no longer a last resort. It was a weapon of policy. By the end of the war, inflation ripped through Europe. In Germany, the Reichsbank, under immense political pressure, printed marks until they became worthless paper. People burned money for heat because it was cheaper than wood. It remains the most infamous example of a central bank destroying a society. But even that disaster did not end the experiment. It only confirmed that central banks were now indispensable. Then came the Great Depression. In the 1920s, the Federal Reserve kept interest rates low, fueling a massive speculative bubble in the stock market. When that bubble burst in 1929, the Fed did the opposite of what it promised. It failed to act. It allowed the money supply to contract by nearly a third. Banks collapsed, credit froze, millions lost their jobs. The institution created to prevent panics had presided over the greatest economic collapse in history. Out of the ashes of World War II, a new order was built. In 1944, representatives from 44 nations gathered at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. They designed a global financial system with the US dollar at its center. The dollar would be backed by gold, and every other currency would be pegged to the dollar. It seemed like a return to stability, but there was a flaw. The United States began to print more dollars than it had gold to back them up.
By the 1960s, the cost of the Vietnam War and massive domestic social programs began to drain the U.S. Treasury. Foreign nations, led by France, began to suspect the fraud. They demanded their gold. The gold reserves of America started to bleed away. President Richard Nixon faced a choice: either impose austerity and shrink the government, or break the promise of gold. On August 15, 1971, Nixon went on television and announced that the dollar would no longer be convertible into gold. The anchor was cut. For the first time in human history, the entire world was operating on fiat money, currency backed by nothing but government decree and the faith of the people. The age of restraint was over. Central banks now had unlimited flexibility. They could create money at will, and they have. Consider the crises of the last half-century. In 2008, when the global financial system imploded due to reckless gambling by Wall Street, central banks responded with unprecedented force. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan created trillions of dollars, euros and yen out of thin air. They called it quantitative easing. It was a complex term for a simple act: printing money to buy bad debts from rich banks. For Wall Street, it was salvation. Bonuses continued to flow, the party went on. But for ordinary savers, it was a slow-motion theft. When central banks print money, they dilute the value of every dollar you earned and saved. The new money enters the system through the big banks and financial institutions first. They get to spend it before prices rise. By the time that money trickles down to your wages, prices for housing, food, and energy have already skyrocketed. This is known as the Cantillon effect. It is why the stock market can hit all-time highs while the average family struggles to put food on the table. In 2020, during the pandemic, this process went into overdrive. Central banks printed more money in 2 years than they had in the previous 2 centuries. Stimulus checks, corporate bailouts, bond purchases, all funded by money conjured at a keystroke. The balance sheets of major central banks exploded to levels that would have been unimaginable to the economists of the past. The justification was always stability. The result was the highest inflation in 40 years. We are told that inflation is caused by supply chains, by greedy corporations, or by foreign wars. While these play a role, they are not the root cause. As the economist Milton Friedman famously said, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It is a tax that you do not vote for. It is a transfer of wealth from the prudent to the reckless, from the saver to the debtor, and from the citizen to the state. This is the hidden truth of the modern world. Central banks are not neutral referees in the game of capitalism. They are the active managers of a system designed to encourage debt. They have created a world where bad behavior is rewarded with bailouts and prudent behavior is punished with 0% interest rates. They have distorted the price of money itself, which is the most important signal in a market economy. When the price of money is fake, every other price is a lie.
And now we stand at a precipice. The contradictions of the system are mounting. Governments are running record deficits, assuming their central banks will always be there to buy their debt. Markets are addicted to cheap liquidity, panicking at the slightest hint of withdrawal. The gap between the ultra-rich, who own the assets that inflate, and the working class, whose wages stagnate, is tearing the social fabric apart. Trust is a fragile thing. Money is, at its core, a ledger of trust. If people lose faith in the dollar, in the euro, in the yen, central banks cannot print credibility. History is littered with the corpses of currencies that failed because the people who managed them believed they were smarter than the market. From the Roman denarius to the French assignat, to the Weimar mark, to the Zimbabwean dollar. The names change, but the story is always the same. Power corrupts, and absolute power over money corrupts absolutely. So what does this mean for you? It means recognizing that the game is rigged. It means understanding that when politicians speak of spending, they are often speaking of borrowing from a future that has not yet been earned.
It means realizing that true wealth is not the paper in your wallet, which loses value every second you hold it. True wealth is in assets that central bankers cannot print. It is in gold, which has survived every empire. It is in land. It is in productive businesses. It is in the skills you possess. The secret history of central banks is not really a secret at all. It is written in every crisis, every bailout, and every inflationary spiral. These institutions were born to serve the state's need for war. They grew by stabilizing the crises they helped create, and today they sit at the heart of a financial empire that spans the globe. They are the puppet masters of the global economy. They are not evil men in a dark room wringing their hands. They are bureaucrats, academics, and bankers who truly believe they can manage the complex web of human interaction that we call the economy. But their hubris comes at a cost, and that cost is paid by you. The next time you see a headline about interest rates, or hear a central banker speak about soft landings and transitory inflation, remember the history. Remember Jekyll Island. Remember 1971. Remember that the money in your pocket is not yours. It is a liability of the Federal Reserve, a temporary token in a system designed to erode its value. Awareness is the first step. The system relies on your ignorance. It relies on you believing that finance is too complicated to understand. It isn't. It is simply about power. And for the last century, that power has been centralized in the hands of the few. But history also teaches us one final thing. No empire lasts forever.